Okay. If at any time during this workshop you have questions, comments, anything you want to share, anything to add, speak up. We don't have any formal sharing hour in here. So we're all friends together, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to learn how to be better sponsors. We're trying to learn the big book, find out where everything is and how it all ties together. And when we get to the steps, we're going to learn how to teach the steps so that we can be effective in our carrying of the message. Today we're going to start with the 4th chapter, We Agnostics, on page 44. The first thing we have to come to grips with here, with respect to this chapter, is that it addresses a very real problem, one which is not a sometime problem, but affects maybe 40 or 50% of everybody who walks through that door. So we're not looking here at something which we're going to dismiss or take lightly. We're going to also recognize that what this chapter addresses is fundamental to the entire program. The 12 steps rest squarely on a bedrock of trust and faith. And when we understand that, then we don't get confused by the human solutions which are constantly thrown at us. Our job as sponsors is to help our sponsees through the process of working the 12 steps to arrive at a place where their faith is strong enough that they are able to in fact rely upon their higher power, trust their higher power, seek knowledge of God's will for them, and be obedient to that will. That's the bottom line. And this comes about as a result of working the steps, and it comes about automatically. Another great thing about being a sponsor in AA is that you don't have to worry about whether this stuff will work or not. You know absolutely that if your sponsee does the work and continues to follow directions, that they will recover, and they will stay recovered, and they will be in a state of remission from an incurable disease, and that they will grow spiritually, and that their life will begin to have great meaning because they will be carrying a message. They'll be doing God's work instead of their own. Which doesn't mean that we ever teach them not to care for themselves, not to take care of their necessities. Of course, we don't do that. But what we do is we show them that the emphasis must always be on God's will and away from our own. Now, what we learn in this chapter is of enormous importance. This chapter is perhaps one of the most beautiful few pages in any language. It is obviously inspired, and there's a structure to this chapter. Now, a lot of the chapters have a structure, but they seem to bounce around a lot, and then once in a while you find things that are stuck in that don't seem to fit. Or you find there are things which are omitted, which you have to find in other parts of the book. But this chapter follows a very distinct, very important, and very powerful format. In other words, it is dealing with a concept, and it's dealing with it in a straightforward way. The concept is simply this: that the person coming through the door who considers himself or herself an agnostic is dealing with a spiritual disease, and that spiritual disease is killing them. And being an agnostic does not mean that they are denying God. What they are doing is denying a belief in God. And there's a vast difference. They are not saying there is no God. They're saying, I don't know whether there is or there isn't. But of course, once we see that that's so, then, and we know that their reliance must be upon God if they are to recover, then something has to happen here. And when this chapter was written, it was apropos. It was what the lawyers call apposite, but even more so now, because the theme of this chapter, basic theme, is that those who come in the door, who are suffering from the malady, the malaise of agnosticism, are really following what they have been taught and what they've come to believe, which is that science and intelligence and physics and mathematics and all of these things will explain everything man needs to know. That the solution, in other words, to human problems, including the problem of alcoholism, rests in the rule of reason. That we are to seek answers scientifically, intellectually, reasonably, and we're to seek those answers based upon human knowledge, human endeavor, human ingenuity, and that therefore, since science and the rule of reason works in most things in life, it ought to work here. And so we're going to reject the idea of relying upon an unseen, unknown, massive power out there, which we may intellectually understand exists in some form or another, but cannot believe has anything to do with us personally. Now recognize, please, remember when we were reading Bill's story, how important that was to Bill, that his concept was that there might be this overwhelming and massive intelligence which put all this together and keeps everything moving in synchronicity. That this God, this massive power, could have anything to do with him personally was just far too great a stretch. And so he just didn't believe it. He thought that people were self-deluded or hypnotizing themselves, or at the very worst they were listening to others who were promising them that this was all true and believing it without any evidence, simply believing it on the basis of some kind of blind faith. And so Bill, being a very smart guy and being very hip and very into modern stuff of the 30s, had no reason, nor did he wish to believe in any way in a God personal to him. Now, what did his friend Ebby say to him? And Ebby, this wasn't original with Ebby. Ebby learned this from the Oxfordians. What Ebby said to him was, you can choose your own conception of God. And Bill said that hit him like a thunderbolt, that he wasn't going to be required to accept someone else's version of God. He wasn't going to have to pass any religious test or take some catechism. He wasn't going to have to worship in accordance with certain rites and so forth, but that he could in fact choose his own conception of a God. And then the next thing that Ebby said to him was, it's only necessary, Bill, that you be willing to believe. That's all it'll take. But if you're willing to accept the fact that there just might be a God out there, a power out there greater than you, a God personal to you who actually cares about you, then you're going to be well on your way. Now what happened was that Bill did become willing to at least take a shot at all of this because he saw what was happening with Evie. Again, see how powerful our example is, guys. It's not that we come to say, well, if you don't believe, believe that I believe. Well, so what you believe? I mean, that's a wonderful saying, but so what? It isn't a question whether you believe, it's a question of if I can believe, tell me what I need to do to gain this belief. And the answer is always the same. Bill says that he learned that he had to pray just as if there were a God, because he'd become willing to accept the fact that God might exist. He learned that he had to pray just as if there were a God. And then the miracles started coming. And he could no longer deny that they came from a power greater than himself. He said that was where faith came. And that faith was the greatest gift of all. You will find that quote in As Bill Sees It. And we know from Bill's story that what happened with him was that at some point along this trail of seeking God, he said, God, if you are there, please show yourself to me. And it was at that point that he had that massive spiritual experience, his epiphany, which, by the way, brought faith to him instantaneously, which he never lost. It got clouded, and he got in some bad shape mentally and physically at one point. But he claims and he swears, or he swore, that his faith never left him. I believe him. But then the next thing he says is that this faith comes to most men slowly. But for me it was sudden and swift. And 3 more times we find that same statement made, that for most people, for most of us in recovery, the coming of faith is going to be a slow process. But every once in a while there will be someone who has this burning bush flash of light, the sudden spiritual experience which enlightens them all at once. Somehow or another, some of the members, the early members, got the idea that newcomers would be confused, believing that they had to have a burning bush in order to recover. Well, that's foolish, because what they're really saying is they read what happened to Bill, but they didn't read anything else. They didn't even read what Bill said about it. The truth of the matter is that the big book makes it quite clear that for most of us, the coming of faith is a process of seeking God. So now if we look back at the chapter We Agnostics again, we find that it is approaching this dilemma of agnosticism, what Bill Wilson called the dilemma of no faith, in a very logical, succinct, and powerful way. What it's doing is first outlining for us where we ought to be and how we are to get there. But then it spends a good part of the chapter talking to us about the rule of reason, talking to us about the belief systems that we carried in with us, and showing us that these belief systems did not work, that they would not carry us all the way to faith. That, in other words, the human solution was inoperative when it came to recovery for alcoholics whose problem is the dilemma of no faith, whose problem is spiritual bankruptcy. And so, as we look at the chapter then, let's remember what it is seeking to do. And of course, the culmination of the chapter shows us where it's going to be necessary for us, if we are willing to believe, to take some leaps of faith. And it shows us how to do that. So you can see that this chapter is powerful, it's beautiful, some great prose, some kind of unhandy stuff because Bill, that was the way he wrote. But it is perhaps the most compact and cogent exposition of this dilemma of no faith and how we solve it anywhere. And it does not call upon anyone to believe because I believe. It calls upon us to gain our belief by taking action. Again and again and again we find the same solution throughout the big book, throughout the steps. Everything is based upon the actions that we take. Nothing is based upon us being talked into anything. We're not here to be convinced by others that they are right and we are wrong. We are here to be guided by others to take the actions which will, through the experiences which we have, show us what is right and what is wrong, and how it all works, and what we must do, and how to live our lives from here on out. Because the actions we take are those actions which teach us how to practice the spiritual principles, which we call 12 steps, in all of our affairs. And when we begin to do that, our whole attitude and outlook upon life changes. The spiritual malady is overcome, and when that happens, we straighten out mentally and physically. And all of these things are true, and they all happen. And as sponsors, we need to know that these things are true, not just some kind of an academic exercise that we run people through. But when we teach them how to work these steps, we're teaching them how not just to save their lives, but how to have a life beyond anything they could ever imagine themselves. A life in the service to a higher power rather than a life in service to themselves or to their masters, the people upon whom they have become dependent and who have enslaved them. And we find so much of that too. Let's start out and take a look at what we have here. First paragraph kind of summarizes a little bit. Let's see what it says. This is interesting. In the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism. If you just came in, it's page 44. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Please underline that last phrase. It's critically important to understand that this is the truth which the big book emphasizes over and over again. An illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Now, you know, it's hard sometimes to keep that in mind because we're so bombarded in the rooms these days with human solutions and rationality and all the other stuff, none of which is pointed toward a spiritual solution at all. And yet it all sounds pretty good, and it all sounds as if it ought to work. And when you and I go back to our sponsees with the spiritual message, we're often going to run into a lot of static, a lot of foot dragging and doubtfulness. But we must never lose the message here, because this is the truth. To one who feels he's an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he's an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. Now this is a repeat of the same choice we were given back in that second chapter. Let's take a look at page 25 so we can see how this ties together. This is the second iteration of the same thought, down at the bottom of page 25. We were in a position where life was becoming impossible, and if we had passed into the region from which there is no return through human aid, we had but two alternatives. These, by the way, are the choices that everybody's talking about around the rooms. They just don't know it. They come in here and say, I've got choices today. Well, these are the choices they have. One was to go on to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness of our intolerable situation as best we could, and the other to accept spiritual help. This we did because we honestly wanted to and were willing to make the effort. Now go back to 44, please, and let's make sure we see how this all fits together. The last sentence in the second full paragraph. To be doomed to an alcoholic death, one alternative, or to live on a spiritual basis, are not always easy alternatives to face. But it isn't so difficult. About half our original fellowship were of exactly that type. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life, or else. I want you to notice that wherever the word must is used in the big book, it means or else. And this appears some 63 or 64 times. And when you hear people say there are no musts in the big book, you know that it's somebody who has never read the book. Or if they did, it was 25 years ago and they forgot what they read. Or where they were drunk when they read it. There's musts all the way through the big book. Categorical imperatives. Absolutes. No weasel words. There are no out clauses. None. It's an either-or situation. It's must or else. Perhaps it's going to be that way with you, but cheer up. Something like capitalists thought we were atheists or agnostics. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. Now here's a rule. Listen to this now. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. And by the way, in almost every instance, this applies equally to those who try to stay sober in church. There used to be an outfit called Alcoholics for Jesus. And the longest sobriety they ever attained that I know of, and they were around for quite a while, was about 3 years. I wrote the 12 Steps for Christians precisely because a pastor in a Baptist church who was trying to help all of his alcoholic and addict parishioners to recover was finding that his recidivism rate was 100%. He started coming to my meetings. And I said to him, Tim, the reason that it's not working is because everything you're saying to them is true, but they don't have any way to put it into their life. And that's what the 12 steps are all about. We take all of these spiritual principles and we restate them as steps of action. And then when we take this action, we incorporate the spiritual principles into our lives. They become a part of us. And then we recover. And so we work together. And it's worked. And he's carried that up to Virginia, and he's still doing it up there, spreading it all over the place. Here's the rule now. We could wish to be moral. We could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. Do you need a more cogent description of powerlessness over alcohol, powerlessness over drugs? Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. That's what it means. I heard a man speak this morning at the 101 Club. He's been hanging around here since the 70s. And each time he came in, he would stay around for 2 or 3 years, and he was told, just don't drink and go to meetings and your life will change. And he said, I tried this over and over again, and each time I tried it, my life did change. He said, I didn't. Nothing changed in me. And his last debauch ended last October. Now he thinks he finally has learned a lesson. Like, work the steps with a good heart, put God in your life and keep Him there. You have no power over this. If somebody tells you just don't drink and go to meetings, you might as well say to them, look, if I could just not drink, why would I need to go to meetings? We don't have that solution here, as much as you may hear it. Our solution is in the 12 steps. That's why you and I are here. That's what we're doing here. Now then, this next paragraph is one of the most important paragraphs in the whole big book. It's only 4 lines long, and there's some follow-on language, which is another 6 lines. So these 10 lines constitute something of absolutely enormous importance to us and to all those that we try to help. Lack of power. That was our dilemma. This does not mean that we lack the power over our actions. It means that we lack power over our thinking. It means precisely that we are crazy, insane, screwy, because our brains don't work right. We have no power to change our brains, because you don't cure a sick mind with a sick mind. We also are powerless over the substances which have us by the throat and are killing us. We're powerless over other human beings. We're powerless over much of the events in life. But we're not powerless over our actions. And this means that we have the power to take right action, which will lead eventually to right thinking, which will lead eventually to a spiritual awakening. You see how that works? The recognition that our problem is lack of power. It is not where we came from. It is not who did what to us. It's not what star we were born under. It's not what our financial condition has been. It's not any of those things. It is not that we were abused as children. It's not that we were born with the wrong color of skin. It's not that we have lacked education. It's not any of those things. Our dilemma is that we have no power. And this is something which it may take you a while in working with your sponsees to get them to begin to accept as being true. Because so many times when you get people these days, they have been thoroughly imbued with human solutions. They have been given every kind of excuse for their crapped out behavior, and they've come to love these excuses. They've come to the point where they accept that they are awash out there in the tide line, and there's nothing they can do. They're the victims of life, the victims of their past. And therefore they're not responsible. And they come here and we say, whoa, wait a second, you are responsible. You are responsible for everything that happens. In one form or another, you are responsible. This does not mean you're at fault. Your troubles of your own making, they have arisen out of yourself. So lack of power is your dilemma. What does that mean? Lack of power is our dilemma. That excludes everything else, doesn't it? It doesn't say part of our dilemma. It doesn't say, well, you know, part of the problem you got here is that you don't have any power. Of course, there's all this other stuff over here. Our dilemma is clearly, simply, that we lack power. And so now then, the next sentence is the answer, isn't it? We had to find a power by which we could live. Now notice it doesn't say which will live our lives for us. It says by which and through which we can live. And it had to be a power, notice the word power is capitalized, greater than ourselves. In other words, we have a dilemma, but we have a solution. Here's the problem, here's the solution. The solution is to find and to live by and through a power greater than ourselves, a higher power, a God. Obviously it says, but where and how are we to find this power? Now, anybody want to know what this big book's all about? The next sentence clears that up beautifully, doesn't it? Well, that's exactly what this book is about. That's exactly what this book is about. Where and how to find this power. That's what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. Period. We don't offer other solutions here, guys. And as sponsors, you got to understand that. This doesn't mean that we ignore human problems or that we're unsympathetic to people's problems as they arise. Not at all. Doesn't mean that we brusquely cut people off personally or in meetings and say, don't talk about that, just go pray. Not at all. We try to help people find solutions. And sometimes we will find the solution to a particular human problem right there in the actions of the person having the problem. Remember, the courage to change the things we can. That's why we have that phrase in the Serenity Prayer. And as sponsors, it's not a bad idea to be aware of that. That there are a lot of things that your sponsees are going to be able to take care of themselves. Get back to work. Get off your butt and get going. Get out of the box. Get away from home. Leave that dependent situation you're in. Get out of it now. It doesn't work. Get out of it. Over and over again. If you're having problems at work, work harder. There are all kinds of things that we can help them with because we can see that through their actions they may very well be able to help themselves. This program requires of us that we do what we can do. Everything in the steps is built around the concept that there are actions which we can take, that we're not powerless over. We can take these actions, and we must take these actions. And when we do, then God steps in and does what He promises. First, we do what we can do, and then God does what He promises. And we can do what we can do, and God does what He promises. The courage to change the things we can. And the wisdom to know the difference. And you may have to help out along that wisdom trail, too, guys, from your own experience. Be able to point out from time to time where there are things which must be accepted as being unchangeable by us, and where we must take action because it's something that we can do something about. And so don't misunderstand that our job as sponsors is to just simply be preachers of the gospel of AA. Pray about it and accept it and so forth. We do plenty of that. But there are also the things that we, in our own collective wisdom and in our experience, we can bring much help to our sponsees in terms of what works and what doesn't work in their behavior. However, the answer to their problem is to be found in finding a power greater than themselves. Now let's go on down 2 more sentences. That means we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. And it means, of course, that we are going to talk about God. Do you see any weasel words there? Do you see any beating around the bush there? You see the big book taking the position, oh, well, they might leave if they hear about God. What are we going to do, guys? We've got to make up our minds. If we're going to be honest with the people we're helping, especially new people, are we going to tell them how we recovered leaving out God? How do you do that? If your recovery is based upon the adoption of a spiritual way of life, to seek, to find, and to be obedient to a loving God, how do you leave God out of that equation when you're talking to somebody who's new? How do you explain to someone that you have recovered and not mention a higher power without lying, deliberately omitting? What are you going to say? I recovered because our groups are these wonderful, gigantic encounter sessions? Because I have learned how to do self-help? Because I read all these books with red covers to tell me about how to get power here and power there? What lies are you going to tell them? We need to tell them how we recovered, don't we? Well, the big book doesn't worry about that. Let's tell the truth. That's what this whole chapter is about, telling the truth. This means we're going to talk about God, and it does. Okay, let's go to the middle paragraph, which begins, yes, we have agnostic temperament. Page 46, Frank.
Okay, thanks.
We of agnostic temperament have had these thoughts and experiences. Let us make haste to reassure you. We found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results, even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power, which is God. Now, those last four words, every time you hear the apologists try to use power as anything other than God, open the book to page 46. What does it say? Comprehend that power which is God. Now, you know, people are free to interpret this stuff any way they want. But if they purport to be teaching out of the big book, they ought to know what they're talking about. In the big book, a power greater than ourselves is God. Yes, Hal?
Yeah, Jim. I absolutely believe in a power greater than myself that I still do not understand.
Right.
And I'm trying to help people, and I honestly say to them, I have incredible faith in something, in a power greater than myself, but I don't know what it is.
Okay, that's fine. You certainly do not deny their right to call this power God.
Right.
Okay. It's just that you don't.
Well, I'm saying me as a sponsor person, is it not advisable? Am I in a gray area that I should feel that I should know what God is as the steps go to enable us to find a God of our understanding? I still haven't gotten that after some years.
Well, wait a second. That's a really important point. If you were to quiz anybody in this room right now as to their understanding of God, at the bottom of whatever their understanding is, you will find their experience of God. As a matter of fact, since we cannot touch or see the face of God, assuming God has a face, it's because we're dealing with an unseen power, which we know is there, but our senses are not capable of defining in any way. Most of us, I would say 99% of us, will define the God as we understand Him by reciting to you the experiences we've had with God working in our lives. This is how we come to understand God. And so your experience is as valid as anyone else's. And in defining, nobody claims to fully understand or comprehend God.
Well,
but we do know from our experience how God has worked in our lives. Now, you may have some religious beliefs which enable you to define God in, say, in scriptural terms of some kind, which is fine. But that's not something which you would expect someone else to believe. They may if they wish. If someone asks you point blank, what's your understanding of God? You give them both barrels. Tell them exactly how you understand God. But make sure they understand that they are free to pick their own conception of God. But let's not pussyfoot around with this. The fact is, the big book, if we're following the big book, the instructions here and the language here is clear. That the power they're talking about here is God. On the previous page it says this means we're going to talk about God. I don't know how more clear we can make it. And so it's one thing to say you're perfectly free to have your own conception of God or no conception of God. That's up to you. We're not going to tell you what you are to do. We're going to tell you what we've done.
Okay. More to the point, my question is, with me, I don't have to say I absolutely believe. I do not understand what God is. I believe 100% emphatically there's a power greater than myself.
Okay.
That I can't tell a sponsee what that is to me. Am I doing him a disfavor?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not. You are helping him form his own conception and his own understanding. Okay, going on.
Can I just ask you about that? I'm sorry. But isn't it a contradiction then?
What?
If we say it is a God of your understanding and God is in there, what's our God then? I mean, is it God that's, Jesus, or is it a God of the Jews, or it's a God of your understanding?
Well, the next paragraph may help.
Okay.
Then let's see if it does. If it doesn't, then we can explore this further. Much to our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and to effect a contact with him. Now here's the rule. As soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, a spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. This is talking about the 12 steps. Other simple steps, following directions. We found that God does not make too hard terms with those who seek him. To us, the realm of spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. It is open, we believe, to all men. And so in AA, we have our own conception of God. God as we understand him. Whether you wish to use the term God is up to you. We do not need to consider another person's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach. And what this is saying is, let's get started here. Let's not get hung up on this. Now you make the approach. And as you do, you will begin to experience God working in your life. And as you begin to experience God working in your life, you're going to find that you come to understand God in your own way. Your conception of God will come about as a result of that. Yes?
Yes, I was going to say, like, step number 3, it made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. It's
Sure.
just what you said, like, as more and more you understand God, you'll be able to more and more turn your life and your will over to him. And even in the traditional Christian faith, the God of the Bible asks but one thing. He says, put me first and love your neighbor. And that's what you're doing in AA. You're putting God first. If you're seeking God, you're going to find him. Mm-hmm. And love your neighbor, not just your friends.
Very good. Yes, John.
One thing I get confused with, I'm still a little confused about it, is my own conception of God. Does that also include the relationship you have with God? Because the big book does kind of specify the relationship someone has with God. Like on 449, everyone says read acceptance. Nothing happens in the world by mistake. Well, that may be one person's conception of God, but, not to get into a long, drawn-out discussion, but I think there's things that happen that have nothing to do with God.
Well, Dr. Paul had this very specific thought in mind there. I knew him very well. He's dead now, but what he was saying was that nothing's going to happen by accident because things are the result of other things that have happened. In other words, we're going to be what's happening today is the result of what's happened in the past. That this is all a continuum. He's not suggesting that God is arbitrarily arranging everything in our lives. That somehow it was writ large on some blackboard in the sky, and is unchangeable and immutable. He's not suggesting that at all. What he is suggesting is that we are seeing the consequences of our own actions, and the consequences of the actions of others who are around us. That these consequences are those consequences which naturally flow from the principles which God has ordained for us to live by. In other words, it all goes back to the principles. It all goes back to how we are living our lives, and that goes back to how do we practice the principles in our affairs.
So we reap what we sow.
Yes. Yes, Dave.
Do you understand that as soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, would that be the same as the second step?
Oh yes, that's what this is all about. Exactly.
Can I just say?
Yes.
I'm Frankie, alcoholic. Thank you, Jim.
Hi, Frankie.
Thanks for being here. I can't help but think that the things in this world that I know, I couldn't even begin to imagine how they could have materialized. I'm thinking, if the day ever comes where I have a sponsor, I think, and I'm going to go through any of this stuff, and I want to relate a spiritual attitude or a presence, or if I want to make an effective awareness of being powerless over, the universe. I think I would probably do it, try to be a little more dramatic. For me, it could be a little thing like, a great big ocean, something that would just, because you know how we are, we like to see and touch and feel, I know that there's some things that are just undeniable. You just have to concede to, and that's, I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, but there's just so many unexplainable things, that I think it would be pretty easy to give, hey, I couldn't do that. Do you think you could understand how that could be created, or that sort of thing? And that might make it a little easier. Or maybe someone that doesn't have any contact with a higher power, doesn't know how to get there, or doesn't know where to look.
Right, and that's certainly the solution, or the beginning of the solution for someone who is an atheist. The agnostic is more likely to say, I'm not denying that there's been a creative intelligence here that got all this going. My problem is in believing that this power is personal to me. See, that's the leap that has to be made. The leap of the second step is precisely that I'm going to be turning my life and my will over to the care of this power. Now, this is a highly personal relationship from here on out. In effect, what we're doing is forming a partnership. There are things I must do and the things that God has promised to do. So this is the leap from the belief that, yes, there must be something that put all this together, to, yes, this power is personal to me. And I can talk to this power and he will listen to me. And that's where the second step gets a little hairy, because it was the same leap that had to be made by all the first members. And they had to get from what you're talking about to who created all of this, and what human could possibly have done it, or is it just chance? And when you see the complexity, you have to feel that this is not like, the theory is if you put 10,000 chimpanzees on typewriters, they would reproduce War and Peace just by random chance. Well, of course, that's just, maybe it'd take 1 million, maybe 5 million, maybe 50 million would never do it. Who knows? I mean, how do you prove something like that? So we're pretty sure that this didn't all happen by chance. You got to go from there to turning your life and your will over the care of this power, a highly personal relationship, and that's the dilemma of no faith. That answer your question?
Sure does.
Okay, who's next? Anybody else have something? Yes, Alex.
Just real quick, so I can have a final clarification, Jim. Again, on page 45, and it means, of course, that we are going to talk about God, capitalized God.
Yes.
Can the word God there be replaced by a higher power, the great spirit of the universe, or whatever it might be? Or is the word God pertinent to use with helping somebody else?
Well, the people who wrote the book, and especially Bill Wilson, felt that God was the most universally accepted three-letter word to represent this greater power, and that God is something that each of us can use even in whatever sense we wish to, but still communicate with each other. Because the moment you begin to use euphemisms, you get less and less precise about what you're talking about. And this is part of the problem people have who are dealing with semantics in here. That somehow or another this greater power can be a motorcycle or a doorknob or something like that, or even the AA group itself. Because sure, if you want to take the capital away from power, and you say that the AA group is more powerful collectively than I am individually, nobody can argue with that, or maybe nobody can, but you're not going to find anybody on their knees praying to the group or to a doorknob or an ashtray. So when we talk about a higher power capitalized, we use the word God because it is universally understood. Okay? Now go to the top of page 47 for even further elucidation. When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. Is that clear enough? I mean, you couldn't be more clear. This applies too to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to effect our first conscious relation with God as we understood Him. Afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which then seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth, but if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere, so we used our own conception, however limited it was. Notice the two rules then. It's very simple. The new person is to choose their own conception of God, and the new person must at least come to a point where they are willing to accept the possibility of the existence of this higher power. Because once that acceptance has been achieved, the acceptance of this possibility, then we can begin to talk to them about praying, even if they have to pray to whom it may concern, or God if you're there. Because practical experience of millions of us teaches us that the moment that we begin to pray to God, even if it's to God who may exist, things start happening that we cannot explain in human terms. And after a while, we have to come to accept that these are coming to us from a power greater than ourselves. That's when faith begins to grow. And so when we speak of God, we're speaking of each of our own individual conception of God, but yet, if you stop and think about it, when you're in a meeting and you hear someone use the word God, You almost never would hear anybody say, "What do you mean by that?" Because we each have our own concept of what that word means, but we communicate by using it. That makes sense?
Yes, I know some Zen Buddhists, and their God is a higher power. That's what they call it, higher power.
Well, I know some atheists, and their God is their better self.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still, and I say to them, that's what we have learned. We're going to find God deep down within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's what happened to you. Think about it. Yes, Charlie?
Just to clarify for myself, so basically what you're saying is if I were communicating, I may want to use the word God just because it's more like of a word that can be passed around and understood. But if let's say somebody I was sponsoring decided that their God was Allah or Buddha or something, or they wanted to call it something else,
No
but
problem.
they still had the faith the same way the book talks about, not being a doorknob or a cat or something, that would work.
Yeah, well, but if you look at any of these religions, well, I don't know about Buddhism, but in the major religions, the words that they use mean God in their religion.
Yeah, the big book even says my creator is one of the
Okay.
prayers.
Well, there are all kinds of ways that we speak of God, but if you were to start using all those different ways, it would be utterly confusing. And if you talk about the spirit of the universe, and you mean God, why wouldn't you just say God?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the big book does.
Yeah.
Yes.
An educated man once told me the French spell God D-I-E-U, which means do I ever understand?
Mon Dieu.
Can I ask a question, sir? Again, you know I am. I shared one time about being raised in an orphanage, Catholic orphanage. And I think I don't exactly remember entirely, but I know that some individual, after I had said that, it made me feel pretty bad that maybe I was wrong for saying anything about spirituality or my religion. Somebody said to me that, now this is somebody that I looked at because they were a director of a big helpful part of, recovery and, clinically and all this and that. I said spirituality and religion has nothing to do, it doesn't belong in this program. And I was dumbfounded, because I don't know faith, what comes first, faith or spirituality. And I think that was the issue. And I had this same conversation with another fellow that's got some time in here, and just for my own benefit, he goes, well, what do you want to be, sober or right? Well, I'd like to figure out, I'd like to be both. I'd like to be free, clean, and sober, and have a good idea of what I'm doing. And if I can pass it on so that I can give somebody a better suggestion of what you may be trying to give them, or not that it's a competitive thing, but hey, that's and somebody, a couple other people shared after that person and said a few things that made me feel great, like, which I can't remember because it was a little bit more advanced than what I'm used to, but they interpreted it so well, and I was so relieved because I hadn't offended everybody. I think that one individual may have made it, but is there a question? Did I just ask a question, or I just make a statement?
Yeah, the question is, do you take your lunch or ride the bus? No, look, you asked a question, but you see, the problem is the question poses a non sequitur. That means these things they don't compute, they don't connect with each other. Spirituality, what comes first, spirituality or faith?
I would think faith.
Well, what's the point of the question?
In my way I was taught and raised was that I had to have faith. and their faith in God. And because I believed in that gave me my spiritual presence. It gave me a spirituality. And it was a while back, but it was a very, very serious topic, and it was pointed out where, you know, I mean, I want to get as much facts as I can right. You know, I want to get the right facts for myself, and then maybe somebody else.
Okay.
But spirituality and faith, as far as I was always brought up, and I spent 9 years in a Catholic orphanage with nuns. Now, maybe I'm screwed up so bad that I don't know, but from what I remember, that I had to have faith and believe and trust in God and pray to God.
Well, the question then is, if you have faith, are you therefore spiritual?
I believe so.
Well, my sponsor was was Father Joe, was a Jesuit priest. And he told me he had all of his religion in the church, but all of his spirituality came from AA. Now, I don't know who's right about that, but what difference does it make? Wait a minute. Let me make sure, because we're dealing here with the Big Book and what it reveals to us, and we either choose to believe it or not. And that's entirely up to you. But the Big Book teaches us that we're going to have a spiritual awakening when? When does that come?
These steps.
As a result of working these steps. And we recognize by the time we reach the 12th step that we've had this spiritual awakening. Right? And Bill talks about the spiritual experience, which was the same, by which he meant the same thing as the spiritual awakening. He talks about that happening as early as the 5th step. That we begin to have a spiritual awakening or a spiritual experience all the way back in the 5th step, because we've been freed from much of the things which blocked us from God. Now, here's the problem: if you may have all the faith in God in the world, more than anybody else in the world, but if you are blocked off from God by your defects of character and your guilt, remorse, and shame, how can you have a spiritual way of life? If you're believing in God 100%, but you're living in your own head, you're living in utter selfishness, you block God out completely, how can it be possible that you would be spiritually fit? You believe in God, but you have refused to let Him in. So, you see, this is why I think we need to be real careful how we approach this. And to teach somebody that having faith automatically makes them spiritual may not be true.
No, but I think for me, you just confirm that it starts with faith, and then as you go through these steps, you become spiritual.
Well, look, there's no question that we begin to accumulate faith the moment we start seeking God. Because the moment we start seeking God, He starts doing what He promised. What's the third pertinent idea? The third pertinent idea tells us that the obsession to drink alcohol be removed when we seek Him. We start seeking God, that promise starts coming true right away. How do we seek God? We work the steps. And so as you work your third step and your fourth step, you're taking one leap of faith after another. And each time you do, you say, wow, that worked. This stuff really works. And each time it really works, what's happening to you? You're getting more and more faith that this will always work. And what is faith except the conviction that God is always there, always faithful, and always will be there for you, and that you can rely upon Him absolutely. That's faith, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
But you can have all that faith, and if you are shutting God out, you will not be spiritual. You can talk spiritually, but without God in your life, without God as the Father and you the child, it's very unlikely that you're going to have a spiritual base for your life. Make sense?
Thank you.
Anyone else like to comment on this?
Yes.
I would. Thank you. I'm an alcoholic. My name is Diane.
Hi, Diane.
I can only sit here and think about how things happen for me. Seriously, obviously. And when I started the program, I didn't have a faith. I mean, I wasn't spiritual, didn't have a faith. But I think that when I finally, after I admitted I was powerless over alcohol, and then I came to believe, to me was faith. I came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. And then from there, as I continued through the steps, it evolved into being a much more spiritual experience. It may not be the same for others, but I know for myself that I had to have faith as a result of other people that shared with me what they'd been through, the process that they went through. Faith in them, and to then turn that faith over to this power greater than me. And then I continued to evolve into being a more spiritual person.
Good. Good. I think most of us can echo that. Yes.
I'm Rick, an alcoholic. When I'm right, I am in my ego, and when I am spiritual, when I'm sober, I am in the fellowship which has a spiritual foundation. When you first started your statement, you said the difference between right and sober and all that. I had a very heavy-duty explanation about that. The second time I got sober for about a month, every day. You want to be right or sober? Right or sober? Every day. That's all I heard, you know. Yeah, got it down. Okay, out of my ego. To not be right. To gain some sort of at time, I had a heavy-duty Irish Catholic upbringing, so the faith, the belief in God was already there.
Well, wait a second. Excuse me for interrupting. The opposite of right is what?
Wrong.
Okay. So what they're saying is you need to be wrong in order to be sober? No, I don't think so.
My way of thinking was wrong.
In other words, this is an appeal to you to get out of ego and pride and to do what? To rely on God, to rely on them, to seek the truth elsewhere than in your own mind?
To rely on God, I have to.
Okay. All right.
I'm really powerless.
Well, join the crowd, man. We're all sitting here in that exact same lifeboat, you know. Thanks for sharing that. Yes, Charlie.
And one thing that I wanted to say that kind of was a question - comment. I was taught, I don't even remember who taught me, that every one of the 12 steps is spiritual. So if that were true, then when I come in here and take the first step, I conceive that I enter myself as an alcoholic, then I guess that would be the beginning for me of spiritual change, I guess, in my life, which happened long before I even really was introduced to God or a belief in Him. Could that be true or not? Would I be able to explain that to a sponsor that way too? Because a lot of people talk about spirituality - God, like they go together.
Well, I guess it's very interesting to have this discussion here. But I think you're going to find most of the time that in working, especially with new people, what you need to do is teach them how to do the work and let God work in their lives, whatever God it may be, because that will happen. And if you look at the results as they're detailed for us on page 85, that person is going to enter the world of spirit, be restored to sanity, and become God conscious, whatever that God may mean to them. But it's all as a result of doing the work. We can get ourselves embroiled in these discussions, and this is not in any sense to suggest that we ought not to in here, because these are important subjects. But for the most part, you're going to find in working with new people that your job boils down primarily not only to teaching them the steps, but seeing to it that they work their steps, because the results will be as whatever it happens with them, the result will be eventually a spiritual awakening. Yeah.
This is just for me, but I was raised a Catholic, ground school, high school, and college, and I really didn't get to know any spirituality until I came to this program. And I take offense when people spout the name Jesus or any specific thing to do with a specific religion. I don't believe in that, and it happens a lot in these rooms. I found God first when I saw people in recovery, and I saw the attitudes change, their eyes light up, and the beauty that they had to offer. And now I can look for God in people, in the sunrise and children, and that's, I see God all over now, and I never did in my life before, and it's through this program, and it's through being willing, being willing to see that your God is the same as my God, as far as I'm concerned. And I know a guy who says they ought to abolish religion and set God free, because that's the problem. Everybody trying to cram their religion down somebody else's throat. There's a God, and we all know, and I don't care who you believe in. He's up there, man, and He loves you. And that's the thing that I learned through this program. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, man. That's exactly what Father Joe said. I mean, you might have been listening in back in another life when he said exactly the same thing. This is a wonderful, wonderful session today, guys. Can't tell you how much I've enjoyed it. I'm so glad that you were here. I'd like to share this with you, if I may. God gave us 3 natural instincts: for sex, and society, and for security. These natural instincts are God-given, and they're good. Our instinct for security is good, and it is meant for us to be able to protect ourselves, to defend ourselves, to be secure in our persons, and to secure the safety of those who depend upon us. There is nothing in our program which militates against self-defense. There's nothing that says that to be loving and tolerant of others is to allow them to enter into our home and to rape, burn, and pillage. And if it's necessary for us to, in order to stop this, to go to their home and to cut the head off the snake, then that's what we do. And that's what's going to happen. This is not a matter of revenge. It's exactly a matter of self-defense. So there ought to be no confusion here that we're somehow violating the principles of our program. We are precisely living up to the principles of our program, which teach us that the quickest way for us to be shut off from God would be to allow another human being or group of human beings to hurt us. We don't allow that. What we do is we say, stop right there. No more. And that's what's going to happen. Yes, Helen.
And I do understand where you're coming from, and I've had a hard problem when people get up and say the Lord's Prayer as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's total hypocrisy, those words, if in fact what you're saying is the truth.
Well, there's a difference between defending yourself and being willing to forgive. They're not the same. We're not. Let me give you an example, Howie. When I was arrested and put in prison, they incarcerated me down here in the Miami detention center, and they put me in the psych ward, and I was locked in overnight with a guy who was crazy as hell. And he attacked me, and I knew he was crazy, and I had lots of compassion for him. He headbutted me and knocked my front teeth out. So I broke his arm, and I dislocated his shoulder. I didn't do that with love. I did it to protect myself. But I still have compassion for the guy because I know he's a sick guy. And I absolutely forgive him for what he did. Because how? You can't live with hatred. It'll kill you. This isn't about them, man. It's about us. It's about our relationship with God. And that's why we must forgive the wrongs that people have done. But we have absolute right to protect ourselves against future wrong and future harm. And that's what we must do.
I was confused.
Right after we kicked their ass.
Okay? Yes, David.
What you just said, I see why my life was so fucked up, because I thought the three instincts were sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Oh, yeah.
I had one right.